This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. If you're a regular listener, you may have noticed I've definitely had more academics on the show in the last couple of years because I find critical adoption research absolutely fascinating. I think today's episode will definitely be a great example of why. I'm thrilled to talk with Sunny Reid as she's right in the midst of her Ph.D. program developing a new transformational framework for transnational adoption. I believe her focus on connecting critical adoption research studies with existing child-focused and child-centering scholars is going to be revolutionary over the next decade. We discuss some of what that means as Sunny gives us a preview of her framework, but we also get personal, talking about some health challenges she's had and the pain of working in advocacy when it all comes back to our personal experiences with loss. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Sunny Reid. Welcome, Sunny.
Thank you so much for having me, Haley. I really appreciate this.
I hope, I'm sure the next time you'll be on, it'll be Dr. Sunny Reid.
Oh, God. That'll be at least another couple of years, maybe a year or two, but I appreciate that.
A couple years from now? Oh, perfect. Okay.
Thank you. That's the goal.
That's the goal. I know you're pursuing your PhD, and we will talk about some of those things that you're studying right now. So I'm really excited about that, but I would love it if you would start by sharing some of your story with us.
Sure. So it's such a broad, loaded question for adoptees, isn't it? But some basic background about me is I was adopted when I was a couple months old. I was adopted out of South Korea in 1985. I was born in 1984. And I was adopted to New Jersey to a white family, like so many other of us transracial adoptees. And I've lived in New Jersey my whole life, except for a short stint in Philadelphia. And that's about it. I have a son, married, and still living in New Jersey, as I said. So a couple of dogs, cats. Yeah.
You have your whole adult life. No, from when you were adopted in one city. That's pretty amazing.
One state. Not the same state. Oh, no, but one state. Yeah.
Okay, this is a Canadian fail. Sorry. That's so sad. I thought that was a city. Okay, cool. Good job, Haley.
That's actually really funny. Yeah, no.
Okay, we'll leave it in because I'm super embarrassed. So my face is red. That's good. It's good for me to be humble.
That's okay. I know when I was younger, I had to memorize all the provinces in Canada and their states and their provinces and their capitals as well.
This is a total aside. I am so bad with states and sometimes how I pronounce them. I have a really amazing Patreon supporter who sent me a map of the states. So
that's okay.
Oh,
There's less Canadian provinces than there are American states, so I understand. You're forgiven.
Oh, good way to start. Okay. All right. So that couple minutes covered a whole lot of time. What brought you to all of a sudden being in a doctoral program and researching adoption and childhood studies and how that's all kind of intertwined for you?
So it was almost by accident. I actually never had this aspiration or even knew it was an option for me to pursue a PhD, particularly my PhD, my discipline is childhood studies because, how many programs exist that are PhDs in critical adoption studies. I started by a couple of years ago now with just publishing thoughts like so many other people just in blogs and then getting onto Twitter. And at that point, I had always had more of an academic type scholarly angle to my work. I felt like so many other adoptees that there was something missing, but I had always wanted to bring adoption conversations and race conversations to the public in a way that was backed by good research. I felt that there's already so much controversy and divisions in adoption conversations in the public in general. And I thought that a good way to bridge that would be something very accessible for the public to read that isn't so much neutral, but is drawn on, peer-reviewed research or just in general. And I think that I never wanted to be somebody who took a side, like the whole, I'm sure if you're aware of this, the whole pro anti, like that doesn't help anybody. Like that doesn't help get anyone heard. That doesn't help further conversation. So I just thought that this academic space would be a more I don't want to say neutral because no, but like a more neutral angle. I'm just going to say it for lack of a better word, and maybe less arguable. Maybe I was trying to avoid conflict. So I started out with that, and I guess it actually grew, my blog grew and my online presence grew, and I was really quite surprised at that. And then as I kind of went into it, got more involved in the online community of adoptees, more opportunities arose for me. I was able to be on a panel at the Baltimore Book Festival, just speaking about Asian things in general a couple of years ago. I did other interviews through this, and I was like, oh, there is there's a space for this. And as I continued, my work got the attention of somebody who's also a transracial adoptee who was already in the program that I'm in. She's since graduated and she's a doctor herself now, and she's doing fantastically. But my work ended up getting on her radar. We became friends, and then she told me about the program she's in. It happened to be 5 minutes down the road for me. And I know, right? Like, go figure. And that's kind of how it all started. So I started thinking more seriously about what I was trying to say about adoption. But more importantly, I was always somebody who was looking for the holes. What's missing? What isn't being said? Like, what needs to be said? What is everybody saying already? What is there something new that I can bring to the table? And when I found the program, or when I, was introduced to the program, which is childhood studies, it is, I believe, the only doctoral program available in that discipline. So I think there's multiple master's programs in childhood studies across North America, but I think this particular program is the only one in North America that offers a PhD in it. So what I was thinking was, this is the angle, like, where do we locate the child? How do I make it so that no other children have to experience what so many of adoptees have experienced that were negative? But at the same time, how can I be productive about this? How can I kind of like move the envelope of knowledge, but yet also bring it to the general public to change the conversation? So that's kind of how I got into this. And then it just kind of like took off. I wasn't expecting it. Or just interest in the work in general to really take off, because so many other adoptee scholars are doing such fantastic work. But as I continued through my program, which I'm currently in now, and as I should have, I've refined my approach to what I originally thought was. When I started with my blog, it was originally really focusing on the Asian adoptee experience and the transracial and intercountry adoption experience in general. But what I found was that there really is a need for something new in the field of critical adoption scholarship. And that's where I really think the childhood studies intervention that I'm focusing on could really help.
That's exciting.
And Allie, you were there for my ASAC presentation, and I appreciated that. And that was coming from the childhood studies intervention. So you personally have some understanding of what that might look like for adoption studies.
Yeah. So the title of that was Biopolitics, Western Compassion, and the Adoptable Babies Photo Listing. And I have copious notes on.
Oh gosh, I'm so happy you're interested.
I'm very interested in lots of different things. But one of the things that you said that I hadn't ever really thought about before, And you're very good at giving credit to those who have come before you in research, et cetera. But you talked about a child's body as a fungible tool.
Mm.
Can you explain what that means to the normals among us, myself included, and how figuring that out is like really helpful for us to be critiquing adoption?
So what I meant by that is that the child's body is a fungible tool, is that a child's body becomes this interchangeable commodity that can be used in various ways by adult players. And obviously adoption and intercountry adoption is one of the best places for that to happen, where the child's body itself becomes the tool through which social anxieties about family are, for example, transcribed and then acted upon. For example, when you look at the history of interracial or transracial adoption, for example, one time Black children's bodies were just unacceptable to be in a white home. So then you actually had the very political act of turning to Korea as the okay race to have in the family. At that point, the fungibility is now today it's becoming more acceptable to have the Black child's body inside of a home. It almost becomes this capitalist status symbol to some degree. Whereas now, with political changes, for example, in South Korea, as opposed to 35, 40 years ago, that's no longer in vogue, right? So what you see then is this interchangeability or fungibility of what bodies do we sentimentalize? Which bodies are we going to say this one's okay to come into our home in this given particular historical moment? And I think that in transracial intercountry adoption, we often forget, like we know on a broader scale that politics, capitalism, marketing has something to do with that. But really, it's about taking a step back and really looking at how children and childhood are being used in this capacity. And what does that mean for the broader politics, for broader conversations about race in general? And I think I've always thought that intercountry adoption and the fungible, as we interchangeable race body of a child, how does that kind of drive larger conversations about race and politics and society? And I think that's extremely important for us to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's critical. I think it's a critical piece. And obviously you do too, if it's part of what you're exploring in academia. Now, can we go to the personal side of what you've been experiencing for the last few years? You had a health crisis. You can share what you'd like about that. And just thinking of yourself as an adopted person with a body, we're all human beings talking about here. But because of our lack of medical history and all of those things, I feel like we really do get fully separated from our information, from that tangible connection to our family, like being able to call someone up and ask for a medical history if there's something happening for you personally. Can you speak a little bit about that, please, if you're open to doing that?
No, I think that's an important question. So that's really it's an important question that I'm going to give a two-part answer to. So I'll start with the less personal, so you can kind of have an understanding of like how it informed my personal experience. So I did some digging, and some of the classes I had courses, it's just thinking about this complete denial or almost unavailability. Wow, of this access to the medical records and health history. And it's interesting because if you look at the Hague Convention and these other policies, children are supposed to have certain rights, and these rights they're supposed to be able to participate in being human just like anyone else. They're supposed to have access to things that protect them, which is kind of like a touchy subject. And there's also the right to participation, protection, and oh my gosh, I completely forgot. I'll come back to that.
Hey, it's Haley from the future. I don't think we closed the loop on this. So here are the 3 things a child has a right to: provision, protection, and participation.
The bottom line is protection is the most important part. And what's kind of horrible about adoption is that these records are often kept from children as a way of protecting them and protecting adults from, or protecting adults for having their privacy violated, and protecting children supposedly from any information that might be harmful. And what's interesting to me, I know the case or the comments have been made that it seems like a human rights violation to deny that to anybody. But in a way, you really think about going back to the fungible child and what power does that mean when we do deny a specific human body or a human being that information about themselves? Where does that, we know that it creates them as another, right? But what does that do in a more broader sense by not giving somebody access to their medical records, for example, or putting that on the individual? So to kind of tie this individual cost back to rights in my own experience. So I ended up finding out when I was right after I turned 35 that I had cancer, breast cancer, and it came out of nowhere. And just a couple of months after that, I had discovered that I also have a really rare brain disease called moyamoya disease that I had never heard of. Apparently, it's Japanese for this little puff of smoke, and it's incurable. But there are interventions to mitigate it, but it causes a progressive closing of the carotid arteries to the brain. So eventually what happens is those close off, and then the brain will actually go and create these little offshoots to help continue oxygenation to the brain. Okay, so I found all of this out. And I happened to be fortunate enough that I have access to my maternal birth family. And I reached out to them and was like, hey, I need to know what I knew that my birth mother had died. I knew that there was a sibling who died. And I knew that there were 2 remaining brothers, all my uncles. So my birth mother died, 1 uncle died, and 2 uncles were still living. I knew that my birth mother had died of a brain aneurysm. And then I knew that one of the brothers, okay, actually, no, I didn't know this. So what I did, I knew enough that my birth mother died from a brain aneurysm. So when I found this out about the moya moya, I was like, what the hell? So one of the steps to getting after breast cancer or diagnosis is that genetic testing, right? You can have genetic testing to see what else is going on. Do you carry the gene that might cause this? All that stuff. So I said, yeah, give me the works, right? So part of the exercise was reaching out to whatever biological relatives you have, which again, to me, shows the priority we give to genetic ties. But again, that's a conversation that kind of ties into my work. So I happened to be able to send out the paperwork that my biological family needed to complete. Again, it was only on one side, my birth family, but I had the access, and that was the point. I was very, and I hate to use this term, but I was very fortunate and I was very lucky. Okay. And you know what? I know it's a loaded term, but yeah, I was lucky as hell that I had that access. So it turns out that my biological family, 1 brother died of leukemia, of a blood cancer. You gotta be kidding me, right? And then one of them survived a brain bleed in his 20s. And then the other one had thyroid cancer. So I'm like, you have got to be kidding me, right? So it was all of this stuff that kind of, okay, you got to remember I was starting chemo at this time, all this stuff. So all this stuff culminated to me oh my God, I cannot be the only person who is going through this, and then suddenly is whose whole lack of medical history, right? You have to tell yourself, and again, this is maybe illogical to most people, but the only thing I had to bank on with my unknown health history was, okay, I'm Asian, maybe Asians have good health. I don't know. It was these lies you tell yourself in order to make up for the gaps in knowledge, and so it comes back. So I get all that information. Meanwhile, the genetic testing come back perfectly clear. So this is all just a fluke, okay? Which is bizarre to me. So like, and again, I don't have access to my birth father, anything. So that was better than nothing. So all of this comes back to my earlier conversation. The whole time this was happening, I was thinking about my work, right? This happened before I started school, but I mean, I had already been accepted when this all happened. And I mean, I've been clearly thinking about this forever. So this comes back to my work. Why do we allow some bodies that are supposedly supposed to hold equal, enjoy equal citizenship, which we know is a lie for many of adoptees? Why do we deem them unimportant enough or unequal enough to deny them access? Why do we create, and at least in the Western context, at least in the American context, why do we create these citizens who aren't fully citizens, who are supposed to kind of espouse the idea of rugged individualism? But then when it becomes a health issue like this, the notions that got you into this country, if you're an inter-country adoptee, of family and kinship, suddenly it becomes all on you. Suddenly you're the one who's responsible for reaching out to some people who have non-existent birth family, right? You're the one who's responsible for footing the bill for genetic testing. You're the one who's responsible for all of this. And so it's amazing to me because earlier I had mentioned the policies and the conventions and things like that. And it's almost as though, and I know I'm not the first adoptee to say this, but it's like this, there's no futurity written into adoption, into the adopted child. It's these rights that keep you as a child, but there's no, and again, I say futurity because there's no accounting for the fact that you grow up. You will encounter problems in your health, in your medical records. So you have this child with nothing, essentially, in terms of medical records. And then it becomes their responsibility to handle it if they get older and they discover this. I also then found out recently that one of my half-sister has congenital defects. She has a cleft palate, and her son actually has several issues as well. And again, she's my half-sister. I don't know what side this comes from. It could come from her father. Well, who knows? But the issue is that you don't know. And then the adoptee then bears that burden. And you think about these rights to protection, and you think about these rights to participation that you're supposed to be guaranteed as a child that's being adopted, and these things but they're not, because if you don't have full access, then you're not truly being treated as a full human the way other non-adoptees and other citizens are.
Oh, and gosh, I'm so glad you shared all that. The one thing I kept thinking of was, even for like just thinking of the futurity. I love that how you described that. And some of us, we do get some sort of medical record with our adoption papers, right? Like, oh, this grandfather had such and such a thing, and this grandmother had such and such a thing. So you kind of get this like tiny little bit of information, but because it's stagnant and those people, keep living or die from something, who knows, right? So by the time we're nearing 40, I think both of us are, I can say that I'm a couple years older than you, but we're nearing 40. By the time we're there, our biological family has had an extra 40 years to accumulate medical diagnoses, right?
That's a point. That's a good point.
The stagnancy of that is maintained even for those of us who are quote unquote lucky enough to get something on a paper somewhere.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. I am just fascinated by how you've wrapped up this. I mean, I think this happens for lots of academics, right? Your personal experience kind of informing like, oh, maybe now I'm going to go in this direction. One of the things you shared in your presentation I watched, so that was at the ASAC conference in the fall of 2021.
Seems like forever ago, but yes.
I know. And who knows, when someone's listening to this, they'll be like, well, it's a few years ago. Podcasts are forever.
Yeah, that's true.
But you showed photos of adoptable children, and you talked about how, the photo doesn't show everything, and it doesn't show the medical condition that the child or infant may have. And you even showed one of yourself and what that was like can you talk a little bit about that, but also like personally, do you feel like it comes at a cost to kind of expose yourself in those ways? And even today, right? I'm like, can I ask you about your medical thing? Like there's a cost of our privacy when you become public and you're doing things like this.
You know, I I don't have much shame. I I I honestly feel that I honestly feel that if I had these experiences, good has to come of it. Not good, but it should be useful in some way. So if somebody else can learn from what I've been through, then that's all that matters to me. For me, my way of coping and my way of making sense of things is that no, let me be open about everything, because if one person can change their mindset or something can change based on what I've experienced, then everything I've gone through would have a purpose. It wouldn't be for nothing. It would be I lack control in a lot of things that happen to me, but if there is some way that my experience proves valuable for somebody else, even as one person, then that is worth it to me. I feel like in general, we learn from each other and we improve from each other by hearing each other's experiences and perspectives on those. And to me, that's where the best growth comes from. Obviously, I certainly respect people who are more private about it, and that's perfectly fine. But for me personally, no, the one thing that is hard, I would say, is that even though I shared my own personal picture in the presentation, I mean, there's kind of two things going on there for me. There's one where it's like, you know, I do have positive memories with these people who've harmed me, and that's hard to hold in tension with all of the problems and other things that have been caused by those very same people. And being able to sit comfortably with that is very challenging, because on the one hand, I have to mine these bad experiences of these from that happened from some of these people in my life and expose it. And there is a little bit of guilt. On the other hand, if they didn't do that, I wouldn't be sitting here talking about this. So on the other hand, there's also a part of me, and I feel like I'm not the only adoptee who's ever felt this way or described this, but like there's almost like this feeling of being very divorced from my infant body. I don't feel like the baby I'm looking at in those pictures is actually me. I feel like it's this separate part of me that I never really experienced. And I mean, not very few people remember their infancy, like in their babyhood. But I think, like, in terms of sharing, I feel like perhaps, again, one of the ways I cope is that, like, that person, that little infant can't be me. That can't be me. That was just, again, a body that was shipped here, that was debated over whether or not staying in their country or being sent away was good. Like, I feel so divorced from that same child. And I think that that's also part of it. And whether or not that's good or bad, I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But again, it's just something to hold in tension with everything else. And I think the turn to looking at it academically or scholarly, or however you want to put it, is again a way of safely distancing myself. And I think there's periods where I do have to kind of confront that. It does weigh on you. But, again, I think it comes back to what is the value. And again, if I can make a difference in one person's way of thinking, then again, my experience, that's all that matters. And then it was not for nothing. It had a purpose and it had a meaning.
I definitely identify with that part of your answer, like willing to share so that someone else wouldn't have to, feel alone in their processing, so they don't feel like they're alone or crazy or, whatever
Right.
other inflammatory word
Mm-hmm.
to describe their experience. This actually reminds me of another point from your presentation at the ASAC conference, where you talk about identity being written onto us. And also that identity is our own personal work. And so I wonder if you think about Sunny, that picture of the baby who's not Sunny, but it is you, but you don't really identify necessarily with that infant because that identity was written on as like available baby, like
Yeah.
cute, cute Korean baby to adopt, from the, I'm going to say catalog. I don't know how they were presented.
I think it was just pictures sent. Yeah, it was
Okay.
cute, but
Well, it reminds me of, those humanitarian organizations that have like concerts and then they're
yeah,
like sponsor a kid and you like pick out the package based on the photo of the kid, which is always kind of like, ooh,
yeah.
cringe, especially cringy as an adoptee. But then also, going back to my question, then also your identity as personal work, like how you've built up, like who is Sunny with all your other identities, the scholar, the survivor, the wife, mother, lifelong learner, all of those other things that I don't want to, I'm just guessing some of those are. Um, do you have thoughts on that, or do you want to unpack a little bit about what you were meaning when you were saying those things about identity being written onto us as an adopted person?
So I actually love that you asked me that because recently, and again, this is how quickly things progress. One of the things that I often think of that is that, like, when you're available, what does that even mean as a child? Like, you're available for adoption, right? You're available to be adopted. You've been relinquished. Are, you almost kind of absorb all of the policies, all of the things, the paperwork, the things that brought you, and as an intercountry adoptee, that brought you here. You absorb the racialized assumptions about your gender, right? The very gendered. This is a Asian girl. Asian girls will be more assimilatable. Asian girls will be this way. Asian girls will be that way. And again, I'm speaking that because I'm Asian, and so you absorb that. You absorb that as an object of desire, and that's a huge part of my work as well, is this creation of a child object, or, and I have not dropped the term that I'm calling it yet, but you absorb this. This becomes who you are presented as. And that becomes kind of part of a story about you that you didn't necessarily consent to. One, you were an infant, but two, these kind of stick to you. They stick to you. Then what happens is, as you get older, you kind of like try really hard to form your own identity outside of these ascribed ones, outside of these ones that were given to you, available for adoption, abandoned and orphaned, and these very negative things that, I mean, I could talk forever about, like, why are those even negative? Is it that bad, right? So you absorb these normative assumptions, these things that we think about children and family, and that becomes who you are presented as without even having it said. So when you, as a transracial adoptee, you can't pass in your family. It's clear that you're different, and you don't have an option when you're that young to kind of like resist those earlier assumptions about who you are as a child. The worst part about that too is these given identities can all be shifted based on the needs of the adoption market at that time. That's kind of the worst part, is that you can become a docile Asian girl in one culture or in one cultural moment, but then become something completely different in another, right? So, and this is all tied to again, beliefs about single motherhood at any time, beliefs about single fatherhood at any time. So there's a lot riding on you. So that's kind of what I was saying about these things, that these identities that are given to you. And when you think about kept children, for example, there's almost this privilege because, and again, I'm not saying that, like, non-adopted children don't have problems. But what I'm saying is the political ramifications and the stakes. Okay, you're just exist. You get to just exist. But there's none of this adult, obviously, if you have a child, there are parents who are like wishing, hoping for you, and again, I'm not denying that, but there's this very politicized desire that brings you into existence, that brings especially inter-country adoptees into existence, right? There's these ideas that you exist as a specific idea before you even arrive or even born. So there is a concept that I'll be introducing soon, and I'll tell you now because it'll be after. So the concept I'm coming up with that bridges this gap is called the baby over there. And I don't mean literally over here next to me, but I mean the conceptual, the theoretical over there. That there is this child or this childhood, all of us adoptees, who exist as an idea. And these embodiments of that bring us into existence are sentimentalism, this idea that non-white children or global South children are like less than, their families are less than you. And so this baby over there concept cannot exist, or the baby over their childhood cannot exist without all of that other, those trappings that create the biopolitics, right? Of whose body is valuable, right? Whose body do we turn to and feel pity for? What does that mean? What does that sentimentalism do? Who does it exclude? Who does it include? How do we think about family at any given moment? Like right now we're in this tremendous shift of gay marriage, gay parenting, for example, as an example. That's culturally shifting, right? Our mindset toward that is becoming broader. How does a baby then figure? What is this different baby? How does that how do we as adoptees play a huge part in driving those conversations? So this baby over there is who we all are as adoptees. We're ideas. We exist as kind of these like amalgamations of whatever is happening culturally, socially at the time with children and family. And so that is something, that can be extremely difficult to come out from under as a child. When you are a concept brought into existence by somebody else's desire and acquisition, that I will be talking about, and I'm presenting that as a side note on the 25th. I'm coming up with that's the first time I'm really presenting this formalized version of the baby over there as a term that unites childhood studies and adoption studies, because we're all kind of talking about this, but we're not putting it under an umbrella with a childhood studies intervention. We are all that, right? We are all that. Anyone eventually can become that othered child when you try hard enough, right? So for me personally, I have not yet gotten to a point where I'm like, okay, well, who am I now? I'm actually taking a youth identities course with a woman named Dr. Lauren Silver. She's fantastic. And she was only one of the first people to include adoption and adoptee identities and transracial identity readings and adoption readings on her syllabus. I will never forget her for that. And I love her for it. And so she opened up the class by asking, what does identity mean for you, right? As a youth. And I said to her, and all these people came out with these answers, right? And I told her, I don't identify as or with anything, because it's been given to me so much. And when I did try to kind of tie myself to one identity, it wasn't a very safe place, because it was always thrown back at me. You can't be XYZ because you're Asian. You can't be XYZ because you're adopted. What is wrong with you? Blah, blah, blah. So all of this comes back then to these ascribed or assigned identities that people make on you because you're adoptee, because you're not white, etc. So this is where I also think that race and adoption kind of overlap a lot, because those experiences can happen to a non-adopted, non-white child also. But the answer is that I don't know. And I'm working currently on, and as you know, Haley, the work of healing and making sense of your adoption goes on forever. But I'm working on realizing and finding that identity can be something safe that isn't taken from you violently or ascribed to you or assigned to you, right?
Thank you for sharing that.
Did that answer your question at all?
Yes, no, absolutely it did. And we're running out of time, but I want to ask you one other thing before we do recommended resources. because I think it's really important. And I think it may tie up some of the things that we've talked about today. In our pre-interview connections, you wrote, I had to lose both moms to figure out that my work is worth pursuing. Can you, I mean, first of all, I'm really sorry that you had to experience that. And can you share why that was important for you to share with us?
I think it speaks to the volume of loss and pain that drives my work, the motivation. There's a lot I had to reconcile with in drawing on such hurtful events as kind of this inspiration. But I think that the benefit is knowing that these situations have happened, the losses have happened, but that I can actually have control to do something about it, even if I couldn't do anything to avoid losing those women and losing those mothers. But I can actually turn it into something productive, turn it into something that doesn't benefit just me, because let's be honest, I'm not doing this for my work for myself. I've experienced this. I've had God knows how long to think about it. I'm doing it so that other people and other children specifically don't have to go through what I've gone through. Loss is going to be a part of life, and that's going to be just a natural, unfortunate thing, right? That happens, especially in adoption, especially for children who are adopted. But I think that the amount of emotional lifting and recognizing where this is all coming from in terms of my work, I think that's, I don't want to say that's my motivation, but I think it's something that I really have to hold carefully as I do this work, because there is knowing that your work wouldn't exist unless it wasn't for the pain that caused the desire to do this work is tough. It's a weird place to be in. But I think that's just something that I have a lot of good supports in place for managing when it becomes overwhelming. But there's not a day that goes by that I'm not doing my reading and not seeing myself in it. And as somebody who, again, relates very closely to the work, I just have developed this kind of ability to separate myself and turn that off at the moment. But there are times when I'm just like, I can't read this right now. But,
Thank you for sharing that. It's really heavy stuff that a lot of people that work anywhere in the adoptee community that looks at adoptee things, I think experiences, right? It's so personal. And it's that mix, I think, that you expressed, right? The motivation coming from like pain plus the desire to like know ourselves more also. I too struggle with identity. And so, yeah, it's messy having those two competing things.
mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I really want to recommend, of course, that people follow your work and research as it comes out. You reference something that has already happened briefly, and you are presenting your new research at conferences regularly. So make sure you watch for Sunny as those things keep coming out. So I want to make sure people are able to read, I'm assuming, when your dissertation comes. I know, no pressure. But like this is, coming over the next few years. But I'd love for people to be following scholars and what's happening like right now in critical adoption studies is so important. I am going to link to an article I think connects well with your research. It's an example of something that happened in Canada during the 60s to the 80s. And it's an academic article out of the Journal of Adoption and Culture. It's called Their Reward Will Be a Lovely Daughter, the mobilization of, quote, hard to adopt, and the portrayal of adoption as a gift. And I'll list the authors of the paper in the show notes, but one of the authors is Dr. Raven Sinclair, and she is a Canadian academic on the Indigenous 60s Scoop. She's been on the podcast before, so a fellow adoptee.
I did see that. Mm-hmm.
Has had she's one of the authors on this paper. The abstract says we analyzed 4,300 advertisements of children featured in the Today's Child column, a daily written by Helen Allen in the Toronto Telegram and Toronto Star to illustrate the movement of hard-to-adopt children through the network of adoption. Children featured in the column were characterized by adoptable or unadoptable traits and made into objects. It is very interesting paper.
Mm-hmm.
Just one more quote from it. It said, through an actor network theory framework, we understand how the hierarchy of specific characterizations of, quote, hard to adopt reach the Canadian public. It's, again, one of those things. It's very hard to read as an adopted person, but we don't want to be ignorant, and we want to make sure we know the things that were happening in the past. And maybe, and actually, I know that's happening right now too. Pictures of available children, especially sibling groups, are always being advertised, which I just find abhorrent. And also,
I agree.
Right. So it's in our past. We've not learned any lessons from it. It carries on. And why is that so problematic? So I really recommend that paper. And yeah.
That sounds awesome. And I'm sorry. I love that you mentioned the quote about actor network theory, because that's something that it doesn't heavily inform my work, but it's something that I really appreciate and apply. So, I'm excited because I think, I would like to read Dr. Sinclair's work. So thank you so much for that. That sounds, if I'm honest, not enough work is done on Indigenous adoption in general. So yeah.
Absolutely. And this is from a Canadian team. So I'm not sure if there's an equivalent of something that's been studied in the United States about your scoop there, and if there was advertisements or things, I'm not sure. Anyway, highly recommend. Okay, what do you want to recommend? And also, I'm excited that I brought you something that you were excited about.
I am. That actually sounds amazing, because I'm very excited about this. So I can't wait for you to send that along, because again, I'm going to add it also to my reading list for my dissertation as I'm working on that exam list right now. So I'm excited. Thank you. I can't wait to get that. And I would like to recommend a book called Childhood in a Global Perspective by Karen Wells. Karen Wells is a childhood studies scholar. And I recommend this because it's not adoption specific, but it is extremely accessible. And it talks a lot about the global and political and racial issues that we discussed today. She even does mention children and family and transracial adoption and intercountry adoption. And she's very critical of the practice, specifically because, again, of the ways that children's bodies are being used and how childhood is being co-opted as a way to market and create childhoods, global childhoods. And by global, I mean non-Western childhoods as others. It gives some fantastic insights for people who may not want to dive deeply into the heavy academic work, but it gives you really good insights into how NGOs work. And how they work to harm children, like non-government organizations, like Save the Children and things like that. And again, what's fantastic also is she talks about how ways that children are looked at in other cultures and other instances outside of the Western context does not match up with how we look at childhood in a Western context. And the importance of that is that we kind of operate at least in America, as our childhood is the only childhood. It's the best childhood to adopt children from other countries so that they come and have this childhood. Well, Karen Wells is saying, but there's other ways of having childhoods. And I would highly recommend that because, again, I think all of her political discussions, her policy discussions, how she looks at briefly education and work, child labor, for example, and other contexts can greatly inform how we think about adoption and intercountry adoption and why certain bodies become adoptable. And I think that's really important because we don't think about child labor, for example, as being that interconnected other than let's save children from child labor. But do we really know the whole picture? And is that a very Western imperialist view about like, have we actually asked the children whether or not they want to work, for example. So I would highly recommend that as a very readable introduction to kind of like what I'm talking about today.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I'm going to order that right away.
Yes, please do. It's so good.
I have one question about it. Does it extend to our view of like how social workers right now will remove children of, especially from Indigenous families and overrepresentation of Black children because of their quote unquote style of parenting is not up to Western standards? Like I'm loose, like, believe me when I said, like, I don't agree with that. Do you think we could extract that as well from her book?
I'm looking through it as we speak. So the book is what you're describing, the Indigenous, if you're speaking of Indigenous children in outside of the American context, then yes, but not specifically. I would say that over removal, the social work part is not really a part of this.
Okay.
She's giving literally more of an overview of childhoods in other contexts and how they might be impacted by politics and policy. And so I would say that probably not, but I would still recommend that social workers probably read it because you need to kind of have a better understanding of like how we think about children in general, non-white children. But like, I wouldn't say it goes specifically into that, but I do think it's important because it gives us a perspective on how childhood is happening in other countries and why we may be so critical of it from a Western standpoint.
Perfect. Thank you.
And maybe not rightfully critical is what I'm trying to say. So.
Right. Yes. No, I think we got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. Wonderful. I appreciate your thoughtful resource and explaining so much of your research to us in an accessible way. And I know you're sort of on pause with socials because you are doing this very intense schooling right now.
Well, thank you.
But where can we connect with you online and just kind of follow what's going on for you? And hopefully pop in and see when you're back on socials.
You can use my blog. It's sunnyjreed.blog. Really original, right? And it has not been updated in some time, but you can contact me. There's a contact page through that you can contact me. And my goal is to, post updates once I'm a little further in the process. But if you want to speak with me directly, there's a little contact form and you can just submit it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sunny. I appreciate your wisdom and your willingness to share some of your personal story with us as well. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Haley. It's such an honor to be asked. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I just got to listen to Sunny's latest presentation a few weeks ago at the Adoption Initiative Conference, and seeing some of the excitement from her peers in the field solidified my high opinion of Sunny's ongoing research. One of the ways we can make sure we support critical adoption research to continue is by supporting the academics who are doing this work. And that can mean just following their social media, sending them notes of thanks, reading their research. There are actually quite a few spots you can find free academic articles, like Google Scholar. Your local library can sometimes bring some of those things in for you. And also, if you email the authors of certain studies, they are usually excited to share their research studies with people like us. And so I would encourage you to try doing some of that. If you've never done it before, don't be scared. You can absolutely read the research. It is accessible. It is not above you. And the other thing that I've really, really enjoyed is going to the critical adoption focused conferences. And lots of these folks are presenting their papers and their current research. And these sessions, most of them are super duper interesting. I really enjoyed my time attending the Adoption Initiative Conference and learned so much. And there is such a huge variety of perspectives, from folks talking all about abolition to reform to, all the usual critiques that we may hear, plus new ones, and also therapists sharing what's really been helping the clients they're working with. So I always take away things like, oh, I could tell my therapist that. So anyway, I hope this episode sparked a little bit more interest for you in the field of critical adoption research and what's happening just like right now. So many new things happening, and it's very exciting to see because so much of the work is moving towards family preservation, which I'm a big fan of, as you know. Anyway, thank you so much, Sunny. Thank you to the other scholars that have been on the show and the presenters that I've been able to learn from and share with you. I'm just so glad I get to do this. The reason this show exists is because of my Patreon supporters. They are paying for the costs of running the show. And so if you'd like to join them and make sure Adoptees On continues, you can go to adopteeson.com/community to find out all the benefits you get for supporting the show. One of them is keeping this main feed show free forever for anyone who wants to listen, who may not have the resources to join Patreon. And then there's also a weekly Adoptees Off Script podcast for Patreon supporters. We have a monthly book club, and there's some other benefits as well. So you can check that out, adopteeson.com/community. Thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.